Welcome, welcome. Thank you. Everybody got quiet. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm Chris Lane with Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. Welcome to another Jessica Catto Dialogue lecture series honoring the memory of environmental visionary Jessica Hobby Catto. I want to thank the Catto Shaw family. They are not with us tonight. And this is a lecture series where we bring the thinkers and the doers in all realms of environmental concern. Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, for those of you who do not know, has worked on sustainable agriculture, environmental science, education, restoration, forest health, and most of that for almost 50 years. I hope all of you will get involved in some ACES programs this year. We've got our farm-to-table dinners all summer. We've got our Raptor Fair on July 5th. We've got our astronomy night on August 13th. I'm going to forget these dates. And of course, you'll see our guides at all the area mountains around town. So I assume you all recycle, right? Trash? You drive an efficient car. You got LED bulbs in your house. You take really short showers. My wife can attest to that. I take the shortest showers. These are all those little things that we do that are good for the environment. But I think, as most of you know, there's two things you can do that are great for the environment. Number one is vote, and vote for the environment. And number two is what our speaker tonight is going to talk about, and that is your dollars, your money. What you do with your money, where you put your money, where you invest your money, can affect and does affect the environment on a grand scale. So, what happens when the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, takes a position on climate change? I've dedicated probably 30 years of my career to trying to make the point to corporations that you can actually protect the environment and be profitable. Now that's with one, if we're all agreed on one mutual rule, and that is that we all like clean air, clean water, clean food, and a stable climate. If you like those four things, we can all be profitable. So tonight we've asked Philipp Hildebrand, Vice Chairman of BlackRock, with $6 trillion, I keep wanting to say billion, but it's $1 trillion under management, with their revolutionary new mindset, investment mindset, propelling the intersection of climate change, profit, and social responsibility. BlackRock, their white paper on climate concluded that climate-aware investing is possible without compromising traditional goals of maximizing investments. And the man who's coming tonight, Phil Hildebrand, is former head of the Swiss National Bank. I know him personally as a guy who loves to get outdoors, who loves to fish the rivers and climb the mountains. I say to him, he's an ACES guy, because this guy loves nature. And you wouldn't think it. When he comes up here in this suit and the tie, don't be fooled by it. This guy was biking up the pass yesterday. First thing tomorrow morning is Castle Creek, and it's fly fishing after that. So he loves the outdoors and has a deep understanding of the environment and nature. So with that, I welcome from Wall Street, but via London and Switzerland, Philipp Hildebrand.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a really great pleasure to be here. I have to tell you that Aspen is one of my favorite places. As some of you, my friends who are here, know, it's sort of, I always feel sort of a mountain boy from Switzerland coming to the mountains in Colorado. It's wonderful, wonderful to be here. The only regret I have is that we spent the last 2.5 days locked up in a basement from 7 till 6. But I did get out very early in the morning to see the sunrise. So those of you who live here, I always say to Chris, you're very lucky. This is as good a place as I know to live. So it's a great privilege for me to be here. I'm sorry Larry Fink is not here. You'll have to settle with me, but I can tell you that he cares deeply about Aspen. In fact, when we talk about Aspen in the firm, we always say this is his happy place. So we know that when we're here with our CEO, he tends to be in a very good mood. And secondly, he cares deeply, as you implied, Chris, and I'll show you some more about what I'm going to talk about this evening. I'm also excited to get to know ACES better. Chris, I'm happy if you have me back after this. I'll come back next time with some organic Swiss raclette cheese, and we'll host a raclette evening at ACES made from sustainably farmed Swiss cheese. So that's a commitment you have tonight from me. It's also a special privilege to be here for this lecture series. From Chris and others, I've learned about the work Jessica did advocating environmental and social rights in this beautiful valley and, of course, far beyond. And the more I read about her, the more I realized she's an example to us all, and I want to thank her family and ACES for granting me this special occasion, which I understand is the first of a number of lectures, Catto lectures this summer. The title of my talk tonight is Sustainable Investing, a Turning Point. Now, I have to tell you, I debated for quite a long time, a couple of weeks ago, before I had to submit the title, whether or not to attach a question mark at the end of that. And in the end, I decided against it because increasingly the evidence points to the fact that we have reached a defining moment in the journey towards a more sustainable approach to how we invest and how we interact with the companies we invest in. Ultimately, I believe firmly today that finance can be, and indeed must be, a catalyst for positive change on our urgent journey towards sustainability. Today, sustainable investing, sustainability, but more specifically sustainable investing, is much more than a catchphrase. Importantly, and you'll see this in my comments, it is also more than just doing good. So I think we've come a long way in this debate, including in finance. Increasingly, and this is critical, a growing body of research is demonstrating quite clearly that companies with a strong track record of sustainable practices produce better financial results over the long term. As many of you in the audience know, the term sustainable investing can be used to describe many different things. At BlackRock, we define sustainable investing as the combination of traditional investment approaches with sustainability-related insights that are not typically captured in financial analyses. These insights are usually categorized into three buckets referred to as ESG: environmental, social, and governance factors. Simply put, and this is the key message in a way of tonight, is that you do not have to give up performance to invest in a sustainable way. In fact, we think that you can create sustainable portfolios that may even enhance long-term risk-adjusted financial returns. And we've recently published a paper on this with a lot of the data in it, which I'll make available to Chris for anybody who's interested in the details around the data. This is really a game changer. I was recently on a panel with Al Gore where he made this point as well, that the more we can show that in fact there is no trade-off, the more this is a game changer in finance. In one sense, of course, this conclusion should not come as a surprise intuitively. Think about it. Companies that manage their consumption of energy, water, and other natural resources more effectively, or that foster diverse and inclusive workforces, and are well governed, those companies should be better positioned to generate sustainable profits over the long term. And this is exactly what the data increasingly shows. Yet the field of sustainable investing is still marked by what I would call a skepticism overhang, a view that the incorporation of these so-called non-financial considerations requires a trade-off in terms of financial performance. But now, as I suggested at the outset, this is beginning to change in a significant way. Today, globally, more than $750 billion of assets under management are invested already in sustainable, mutual, and exchange-traded funds. More importantly, assets in this segment grew by about 25% last year and continue to grow very rapidly and clearly above growth rates of more traditional assets. The sustainable investment opportunity is particularly pronounced when we think about the transition to a low-carbon economy. In fact, we can observe a direct correlation between climate change and financial stability, with risk manifesting in three main areas. First, the physical risks to assets from increasingly unpredictable and erratic climate and weather-related events. Secondly, liability risks of those individuals or companies impacted as a result of climate change. And finally, transition risk as we progress gradually to a lower carbon economy. The good news is that these risks to financial stability will be reduced if this transition is managed in an orderly manner, allowing the market to adapt accordingly. During the last World Economic Forum in Davos in January, I was struck by the degree to which this topic has become center stage amongst the world's leading CEOs and corporate leaders. I came away from those conversations with a strong impression that for finance to be a true catalyst to accelerate the transition towards a low-carbon economy, we must shed the skepticism overhang around trading return for social outcomes. Instead, we must increasingly demonstrate that by identifying scalable, sustainable investment solutions that can enhance long-term returns, we can improve risk-adjusted financial outcomes for our clients and accelerate the adoption of low-carbon, climate-resilient business practices globally. At the same time, regulation and investors' desire to mitigate risk is creating additional demand for sustainable investing. Now, this varies, without getting into tricky territory here, this varies obviously from country to country and region to region. We can perhaps come back to that in the discussion afterwards. Europe is in a very different place when it comes to regulatory changes, even legal changes, than the United States currently. In fact, directionally, I would say, if you just look at the regulatory and legal environment, they're moving in opposite directions. But that's only one element of this whole story. So this is the opportunity. It is powerful, and it is growing rapidly. If I understand correctly, although I haven't been following this, but the cover story of Barron's this week, I believe, is on ESG investing. So that's just another example that we are here at a pivotal moment. At BlackRock, we recently deepened, as a result of all of this and our conviction in this space, we recently deepened our commitment to serve our clients more effectively in this area by expanding our BlackRock Sustainable Investment business and by committing to a significant increase in our investment stewardship activities. In both the way we invest and the way we engage with the companies we own on behalf of our clients, we believe that sound governance is key to managing environmental and social factors, and that this in turn will help enhance long-term financial returns. The nature of asset management, and this is an important point that many people miss, the nature of asset management, of an asset management company, is such that we invest money that does not belong to us. Instead, we manage money that has been entrusted to us by our clients. In other words, we are a fiduciary to our clients. Therefore, we do not seek to advance a set of our own moral or social values when making investment decisions. As a fiduciary, we invest in order to advance the long-term financial interests of our clients. Now, and here's the key point, increasingly it is becoming evident and clear that taking ESG factors into account, taking these insights into account when we look at the portfolios and when we do this job on behalf of our clients, that this is critical to these long-term financial interests of our clients. In other words, failure to use sustainable insights in our investment process and engagement with companies would be a disservice to our clients who entrust us with helping to meet their financial goals. And again, as you can see, this is the game changer. And as this becomes known, and as this becomes accepted, and as the data becomes more and more compelling, this really is the game changer, and it's the reason why I decided to leave out the question mark in the title of my talk, whether we're at a turning point in terms of finance or sustainable finance, rather. We see the opportunity for finance as a driver for change in several areas. Firstly, increasing disclosure. Regardless of how companies, or indeed their executives, feel about climate change, or even the science surrounding the issue, climate risk and climate policy can affect a company's long-term returns. So enhancing disclosure of climate-related information will help more investors make informed decisions. That's why disclosure of material climate-related information by public issuers is one of our investment stewardship team's key priorities for our engagement with the companies we own on behalf of our clients. We support the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, efforts to improve climate-related financial disclosure by public issuers. In fact, BlackRock is now represented on the task force, and Larry recently sent out a letter to more than 100 companies regarding their engagement on climate-related financial disclosure. Needless to say, and here we need to be honest with ourselves, intellectually honest, the data is not perfect yet, and much will need to be done in the coming years in this area. The ESG data we have today has several drawbacks, including the quality, coverage, consistency, and in many cases, frequency of the information that we receive. This is why we continue to call on data providers, companies, and regulators to develop better, more consistent, and more reliable ESG-related metrics. However, and I think this is, again, the critical point here, the lack of, or the suboptimal quality of today's data should no longer be held out as an excuse for avoiding sustainable investing. The breadth and quality of data have improved significantly, and in our view, enough to be able to make ESG analysis an integral part of virtually any investment process. New benchmarks and products are making ESG investing more accessible across asset classes and regions. Data is improving rapidly, but remains patchy. This means it is critical to go beyond headline ESG scores for insights. Understanding how and why individual score components can affect returns is key. This can differ across regions, industries, and companies. Our confidence in ESG as a potential source of alpha is rising, but there's still work to be done to make ESG analysis an integral part of the investment process. This is a challenge not only for the financial industry, but critically also for academia. And much work is in fact being done in academia as we speak to improve the quality and the consistency of the data that will be required to really push this forward. We also must ensure that asset owners know what they own. Even with better disclosure, many asset owners will still find themselves struggling to understand fully and appreciate the risks that they may be facing with complicated and idiosyncratic climate-related transitions, be they physical, regulatory, or technological. Just as a prudent asset owner stress tests her portfolio to a range of potential financial and macroeconomic shock events, an increased capacity to undertake climate stress tests or climate scenario analysis on a portfolio would help ensure that asset owners have a clear picture of the risks they face. Finally, financial markets can create innovative products at scale. Green bonds are a good example here. These products allow investors to gain fixed income exposure while promoting projects that are accelerating climate mitigation or increasing the resilience of communities. BlackRock has been a leader in developing this industry. In effect, the market is proving that it can create a mechanism that can generate stronger risk-adjusted financial returns and accelerate positive outcomes at scale. These changes are visible today, which again is the reason I removed the question mark from my title. But things will not happen overnight. There are many areas which will be impacted by attempts to address climate change, from amendments in regulation and policy to advances in technology. This is a crucial aspect of all of this, which will improve manufacturing, recycling, and to move towards a global low-carbon economy. This is where, as my boss and our CEO, Larry Fink, recently said during a meeting at the Vatican with the Pope, and I quote from his contribution there, this was last week, "A corporation's sense of purpose is integral to a long-term approach, and in order to succeed over the long term, companies must understand and embrace their purpose, including the way they serve their full set of stakeholders, investors, customers, employees, and communities alike." Many companies are already on board with the idea that their long-term financial success is tied to playing their part in reducing carbon emissions and improving their impact on society and the environment. One of my favorite examples here is a very significant, one of the most significant and biggest oil companies, energy companies in Europe, has recently made a huge investment in battery manufacturing and in battery innovation. So it's clear that the CEOs are beginning to move. Indeed, many executives that we engage with agree with the need to put a price on carbon and to give investors long-term certainty about the transitions that need to take place. Companies and issuers that have high ESG scores tend to be more efficient in their resource usage and more resilient to perils, ranging from ethical lapses to climate risks, and thus, over time, produce better financial results. And sustainable investing is now coming to asset classes previously lacking in sustainable options, such as emerging market debt. Early empirical evidence suggests that ESG insights may offer the greatest rewards when investing in emerging market economies, where issues such as shareholder protections, natural resources management, and labor relations can be important performance differentiators. The use of these insights across finance will drive developing countries to improve their sustainable practices. There are those who often talk about the conflicts that come with sustainable investing. But let me borrow again from an example that Larry Fink used recently to demonstrate why I think sustainable investing makes sense from an economic and a social standpoint. It is undeniable that the global reduction in poverty during the last century is linked, and we need to admit this and recognize it, is linked to more affordable and available energy in developing countries. The increase in the consumption of energy has helped to lift millions out of poverty. It has also allowed countries to improve their infrastructures and power production, and to run the hospitals and the facilities that we in the developed world have taken for granted for decades. However, as you all know, this has come at a heavy cost to the environment, and it is no longer a choice between whether we share a global goal of reducing global carbon emissions, but rather how we go about doing this while at the same time continuing to satisfy the world's ongoing demand for energy. I travel very frequently to China, and I can tell you that the change that has taken place in the recognition that this has to be addressed, that development could no longer continue at the pace and in the way that it had proceeded in the last decade, is extraordinary. I know of no other leadership today in the world that recognizes as clearly as the Chinese leadership does that this is no longer a matter of choice. They have to find a way to continue to grow with less environmental degradation as a consequence. In fact, I would argue today that this is probably one of the most important objectives in terms of maintaining political stability in China. And when you spend a couple of bad days, depending on the weather in Beijing, it is not hard to recognize how important climate has become as a political objective to the Chinese government. We cannot live in a world where carbon emissions continue to grow at the same rates, but we must also acknowledge the role that fossil fuels will continue to play. The way we consume energy is shifting. Individuals are actually using less fossil fuel generated energy as other alternatives filter into the mainstream. Solar and wind generated power for homes and the proliferation of electric vehicles are two examples where what was once costly technology is now becoming more affordable and therefore increasingly adopted. Energy production is also becoming more efficient. Nevertheless, while fossil fuels will play a role in meeting our energy needs for many years to come, perhaps for a long time, finance is playing a role in improving access to alternative sources of energy. The magnitude of the capital need is stark, as many of you would know in here. According to the UN's most recent estimates, the cost of adapting to climate change in developing countries could reach $500 billion per year in developing countries. The World Bank estimates that 1.3 billion people and 57 trillion of assets are currently at risk. And it is clear that the public sector, including sovereigns and development finance institutions, do not have the financial resources to meet these capital needs. Therefore, if we are going to solve this problem, if we are going to invest in mitigation and adaptation sufficient for the world to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change, then private capital is going to have to play a central role in fighting what is arguably the greatest threat to mankind. And as somebody reminded me recently, a colleague internally, which really touched me deeply, we certainly, perhaps my generation and the one of my 18-year-old daughter, are probably the first generation to really be directly impacted by climate change. But more importantly, those two generations are probably the last two generations that have the ability to do something about it. So the urgency of this task, I think, cannot be overstated. And finance has to play a role in it. If you look at the numbers, it is simply too big to be covered by the sovereign. Unlocking private capital at the scale necessary to help solve these problems is, of course, challenging. But I strongly believe that finance can and will be a catalyst for change by identifying and scaling solutions that can generate long-term financial value and positive outcomes for the global economy. It's this combination of long-term financial value and positive outcomes for the economy as a whole and for society as a whole that gives me the confidence that we have arrived at a point, at a turning point, at a point of no return in a sense, where responsible investing is on an intractable path toward becoming the new normal. And that this momentum will be driven by our clients, in many cases, or in some cases at least, by regulation, perhaps not in this country. Again, that's something we can discuss, but certainly I can tell you from a European perspective, regulation plays an important role here. And by the socially responsible need for those of us able to do so, to safeguard our environment and our clients' financial futures for the long term. This is what gives me hope and optimism that we are, in fact, at a turning point, and that I no longer need to put the question mark in front of the title when I talk about sustainable finance. Are we at a turning point? I would tell you that we are, and when I look at how quickly things are changing inside our own company, in the media landscape, in the awareness of the clients, and increasingly in clients' requests for us to provide them with solutions that can achieve both of their objectives, the financial one as well as the sustainability one, then I walk away today with optimism that we have indeed arrived at a turning point. Thank you very much, Chris, for having me, and I'm happy to be here and try to answer some questions.
Are we on? Are we on?
You have a loud voice, you can...
Yeah, who needs a microphone? Wow, what a breath of fresh air to hear that from Wall Street. This is what, yeah. We're gonna do about 15 minutes of questions, and we've got people from ACES, they're gonna have microphones right now. People with microphones. You can't hear this. Can you hear this? You can? Okay, there we go. So, microphones will be going up and down the aisles. Raise your hand. I'm going to call on you, and I'm going to end it, so Phil doesn't have to do this. Can we go right here? That was the first hand I saw go up over here. The young lady. Nope, down lower, 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 right here in the blue with her hand up.
In a very short description, what is the difference between Europe and the U.S. as far as what you were talking about? And how can we, the people who we've got here, tell our friends to tell our friends to tell our friends, approach our politicians? How can we change investing
Yes, well, let me give you two
on
very
a larger scale?
Sorry, yeah, I think I understood your question. If not, please correct me. Let me give you two specific examples. I don't want to overstate the difference. In terms of, short-term direction, there's no question, as in many other areas, Europe and the US are sadly, in my view, going in different directions. This is true on a lot of issues, but it's also true in this space. Increasingly now, in a number of European countries, there are laws, regulation, in some cases laws, that certainly sovereign assets have to be managed by integrating some of these things that I talked about, ESG factors. So for instance, this is a world I know very well from my past life, in a number of central banks in Europe now, the pension funds of these central banks have been specifically positioned so as only to be invested in a sort of sustainable manner. There are various ways to define that, but let's just say in a sustainable manner. So if I'm an asset manager today wanting to manage assets for such central banks, for instance, for their pension funds, I have to have instruments, funds, mandates, tools to be able to even enter into competition for those assets. Otherwise, I can't even bother to show up. It's true for a number of sovereign wealth funds. It's true for, as I suggested, pension funds. It's true for a lot of sovereign assets. It's true for a lot of retirement assets. In the US, the situation is a little different. In fact, pessimists could argue that the latest Department of Labor regulation actually kind of makes it more difficult to increase or to focus on ESG approaches to managing US pension funds. When you look at it more carefully, the situation is not quite as dramatic as some people make it out to be. So the specific wording in the DOL rules says that if it's a tiebreaker, you can actually incorporate ESG factors. In other words, it comes down to the question that, in my mind, is at the core of all this, and it gives me optimism, namely whether there is a negative trade-off if you incorporate ESG factors. So even in the US, when we talk about retirement assets, as long as you don't suffer, or as the retiree doesn't suffer a negative financial trade-off, you can actually still incorporate ESG factors. But you're not obligated to do so, in contrast to many cases in Europe, certainly with regard to public assets, where you actually have to incorporate sustainability factors, ESG factors. Things are moving very, very quickly in this space in Europe. I would anticipate that very quickly we will have a situation in the European market where if you're an asset manager and you can't provide sustainable investment solutions, you're going to really struggle in the European market. Now, I can also give you a more optimistic, more upbeat message here. It is also clear that from a client side in the US, demand for these assets, or for this way of managing assets, is increasing very rapidly, irrespective of regulation, irrespective of politics, and irrespective of the laws. So I don't want to overstate the kind of difference between Europe and the US. In many ways, you could argue this is sort of historically true, that the US tends to do things driven by the market, and Europe tends to do things perhaps more driven by policy, regulation, and laws. We will see where this journey goes over the next 10 years. The interest from clients is enormous. Today we have, if I look at our own assets, we already have well in excess of $50 billion that are invested in one way or another in ESG-related, sustainability-related assets, and it's growing very, very quickly. And that's true both for the US and for Europe. The difference in Europe, as I said, is in many cases you just don't have an option. If you, as an asset manager, want to manage retirement money in Europe, you basically have to have solutions, where in the US that's perhaps not quite the case yet. But even here, when I look at the client demand, the client inquiries that we receive, it's very clear, once again, that we are at a turning point. And the example I mentioned in the upcoming Barron's is just another example of this.
Okay, next question. How about in the very back? Hand went up first.
First, thanks so much for being here. It's terrific stuff and exciting. A question, if you're analyzing XYZ corporation, thinking about investing in it, we've got traditional metrics that we use. How do you use it in this area? What do you look? We look at earnings per share. We look at management, et cetera, et cetera. How do you measure in this new realm?
Right. So very good question. I'd say there are two sort of tracks to this. One is the actual scoring, the ESG scoring that I talked about. And again, with the task force, when we look at climate change, for instance, companies very quickly now have signed up to report, basically give disclosure on their climate risks. So that gives you kind of a quantitative tool with all the flaws that I mentioned. This data is not perfect yet, but it will improve year by year. There's an enormous amount of work now. We're doing work. All our competitors are working on this. Academia is working on this. Index providers are working on this. The industry is focused on the data, so the data will improve. So you have, on the one hand, sort of scoring that is pretty mechanical and, in a sense, a quantitative approach. In addition to that, we are focusing very much on the engagement with the companies we own on behalf of our clients. We own several thousand companies in the world, anywhere from 2 to 8%. That's the beauty of the scale of BlackRock. And we have, every year, our stewardship team has close to 2,000 meetings a year with these companies. This can be at the level of CEO, executives, in many cases the board. And there, it's much more of a qualitative discussion. And one of the things that Larry Fink has talked about publicly is this insistence of kind of long-term plans. So tell us your plans. If we own a company, we will engage with them and demand that they submit to us and to our clients as the ultimate shareholders of these companies. Again, we're just a fiduciary in between, to submit long-term plans, not just on the business, not just on the strategy, but also on things like climate disclosure, like diversity, good governance, all these things that, again, increasingly what's obvious, companies that are more mindful in the long term tend to be better companies. Intuitively, if you think about it, that's actually it's kind of what you would expect. And so, I suspect we will get to a place, and this is where technology and artificial intelligence and all the innovation around technology can be very, very powerful. As you start to combine pure sort of scoring effects, in a sense, pure quantitative approaches, with more qualitative approaches that you discern from engagement with the companies. And my guess will be, if I'm here 5 years from now, we will see tremendous, by then, innovation, technologically driven innovation, to sort of create composite scores, if you like, of how companies are doing in that space, which will again make that exercise much easier. So for us at the moment, it's kind of on 2 tracks, and the trend, I think, will be to find ways to aggregate these 2 tracks where you have simple scoring methods that will improve year by year based on the quality of the data. And then you have, when you own a company, you engage with that company and you extract information from that in terms of their focus on sustainability, or in the specific case of climate, on climate change.
BlackRock has been really impressive in wielding power in the corporate sector, but what we really need in the U.S. is credible business voices going to Washington and saying, hey, we have to address this at a policy level. And it's not happening. Fortune 500 CEOs are not going to D.C. If you go to Washington, the elected officials don't have climate on the radar. Is there any interest on the part of BlackRock in either pushing the companies you invest in, or even having Larry Fink or you go to Washington and testify and say, this is a business issue, you have to pay attention?
Well, Larry is doing that. As you saw with the letter he published, he's been very vocal about this. And again, it comes from a deep and growing conviction that this is good for the long-term risk-adjusted financial returns. Right, this is where he focuses so much, and as a company we try to focus on long-termism. I mean, the problem is, let's face it, we're all victims of this. We live in a world where the kind of 24-hour or maybe even 12 5-hour news cycle dominates our lives. So it is hard, even when you run a publicly listed company, it's hard to focus on the long term because you've got to publish quarterly earnings every quarter. And God forbid you have a quarter of, something happens and you have earnings that are not quite up to expectations and your stock starts to get hit. So it is very tough in the world we live in to focus on the long term. And that's really been the essence of the message we've been trying to convey. And if you do that, you will see that it makes business sense to focus on these things, whether it's societal governance or whether it's the environmental piece of it. So now, on the whole, we sort of pursue 2 tracks. Again, on the one hand, we have been quite vocal publicly, and by the way, the reactions have been not entirely positive, as you can imagine. There are certainly companies that we own that may not think this is the greatest idea, and more challenging for us, there are also clients who may not agree with this approach. The answer to that, I think, is to provide them with the evidence, Provide them with the analysis that shows that actually in the long term, you create better financial performance if you do this. This is not about us imposing as an asset manager or Larry alone imposing his personal values on these companies. It's about long-term financial performance. We also believe firmly, and this is why I mentioned the stewardship team that we have just increased significantly. In fact, it's now under the responsibility of one of the co-founders of BlackRock, who's been at the firm and with Larry Fink since the very beginning, to sort of underline the importance of engagement with the companies. So, we see this as a dual-track effort in a sense where, of course, you need to be public and vocal about it, but more importantly, what we want to do is engage with the companies, show them the evidence, do the analysis. We just published, as I mentioned, a new paper that shows some of the data, and in a sense, be constructive and be cooperative. These are, after all, companies that we own on behalf of our clients, and in many cases, these are our clients. So this is not about hitting somebody over the head. It's about engaging, showing the evidence, and demonstrating that in the long term, risk-adjusted, at least, risk-adjusted financial returns will improve if you focus on these factors. So we do, I would say, all of the above. And as many of you know, we are very present in Washington. We certainly try to be a voice, but we also want to be, most importantly, an engaged partner to the companies that we own on behalf of our clients.
Okay, Amory?
Now comes a tough question that I probably won't be able to answer.
Well, we loaded him in the audience. This is a plant.
I work on the energy transformation, which is moving from the pace and costs of infrastructure to that of software, and is increasingly being not constrained by the inertia of incumbents, but sped by the ambition of insurgents. That yeasty mix creates winners and losers, and you own some of both. So I'm wondering how you think about the opportunity to help the companies you own in that rich dialogue you engage in to figure out graceful market exits, how to deal with stranded assets. There's over $2 trillion of either unsellable or unburnable hydrocarbons, more than that in the power sector and so on. And as you figure out which companies are good at that adaptation, would you rebalance your portfolio to keep more of the winners and shed more of the losers?
Very good question. So the first thing I want to insist on, we don't have a balance sheet. We're not a hedge fund or a family office that invests our own money. So, we invest all these $6 trillion that you hear, that Chris mentioned at the outset. This money is our clients' money. And that's very, very important to kind of, and unfortunately, there's still a lot of confusion about this. Asset managers, we manage money on behalf of our clients. So we have a fiduciary duty to exercise what is in the best long-term interest of those clients, which is why we can't just kind of come up with an idea and say, oh, this is great, I'm going to do this now, invest in a specific way, the way perhaps I would as an individual or as my own family office. This is on behalf of our clients. Now, you're absolutely right to mention this is in a sense the challenge of being the largest asset manager. As I mentioned, we own over 2,000 companies worldwide. So there are definitely losers in that transition, or I'd say companies that face great challenges. There are those who can benefit from the transition, and there are those who will find the transition very challenging. Now, they're still our clients, or they're companies that we hold, often both. So we have to work with them as much as we work with the exciting cases where, it's a sort of win-win situation. And the way we try to do that is by encouraging them to have long-term plans that they submit to us, in a sense, as shareholders on behalf of our clients, which hopefully will kind of be an incentive for them when one of their significant shareholder asks for long-term plans on, for instance, climate transition, to really go to task about what it means for their own business model, given these challenges that will come upon them as we move to a low carbon economy, for instance, right? So that's the way we try to deal or support, in a sense, those companies that, as you suggest, are on the losing side of this transition, by encouraging them to really think about it, to submit long-term strategic plans, and whether those plans involve a gradual change of the business model, or as in the example that I gave you about one of the largest European energy companies, a sort of pivot to make a major, very significant investment in battery power as a way to reposition the company. That then is up to the company. But what we can do as shareholders is incentivize them, and to some extent use the percentages that we own. Often we are the largest or one of the largest shareholders, so we have a voice. We can incentivize them to think in the long term and to think about the transition of what it means for the business model.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Last question is going to, I want to get someone in the back. You're waving right there.
Could you please give me an example of some of the names of the companies that BlackRock holds that score high in ESG and that are sustainable? Other than electric cars or alternative energy or organic farming, what are some of the companies that comprise the $50 billion ESG portfolio?
Yeah, I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to do that here at this point, for obvious reasons. Because, in many ways, again, we are a fiduciary to our clients. Now, what I can tell you, and I mean this seriously, what will happen, I think, very quickly, is that these scores will become publicly available in many cases, certainly at the level of funds, right? I foresee in the not-too-distant future that if you buy, for instance, a passive product, an index fund, that there will be very quickly, within a couple of years, I would imagine, that you will have ESG scorings on individual funds that you can look at. Companies will do the same thing. This is where my optimism comes from, right? It's not because we're going to go out and shame somebody or kind of put a really great company that has a high score out there and say, look, here's a wonderful company, here's a bad company. I don't think that's particularly productive. The market itself is going to increasingly demand that these scores are part of the material that is published about a company or a fund. Think about, right, today you take it for granted that when you look at a mutual fund or index fund, that you have performance data, right? I would tell you that with confidence that a couple of years from now, we will live in a world, if I'm right with my optimism, that every fund will also have an ESG score on it. Maybe it'll be called something else at that time. I don't find ESG very compelling as a sort of, I always stumble over it. So I think we have to do some thinking here as to changing that. But the basic idea that these scores are going to become publicly available, either in some cases driven by regulation or even laws. I can certainly imagine that in Europe, very much so. In the US, it looks more likely that it's going to come from the client side, so that the market demands it increasingly going forward. So I can foresee that quite easily, a couple of years from now, if I come back here, that you will find next to every mutual fund or index fund or iShare that BlackRock issues, that you will see an ESG score. And the same, frankly, quite likely on companies. And in fact, part of the task force on climate disclosure is exactly that you make it publicly available what your exposure is as a company to climate risk. So I don't think we should be in the either kind of praising or shaming game vis-a-vis companies that we own, or in many cases, companies that are clients of BlackRock. But I have no doubt and great optimism and confidence that we're going to very quickly have a whole new column of data next to performance, next to tracking error and all these things that you're used to if you come from a financial background, you will start to see scores around sustainability or ESG that will start to appear in the prospectus of the mutual fund you're looking at or the index fund you're looking at. I think we're upon that within a couple of years.
We are out of time, but I want to thank Phil, and I want to thank you specifically for pushing companies and organizations around the world to do what's environmentally responsible and climate responsible. And I hope, after all the times tonight he said, in 5 years, that we'll get you back in 5 years and we're going to get an update.
In the winter, I want to come skiing.
You
I
want
had
to ski?
I had an offer today, which I'm definitely going to take
I'm
up.
offered a free lift ticket. But we want to get you back in 5 years and see the progress that corporate America and Wall Street is making, and hopefully it's significant. Thank you for your time. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.